Hey folks, welcome to the channel. Today we are going to talk about variable scope and functions. Today we'll be looking into the scope. Scope defines where you can access a certain variable. When a variable is in scope, you can access it. When a variable is out of scope, you cannot access it. So let's go ahead and see that in action. Let's create a function called test availability. And I'll pass parameter called x, and we'll just simply console log, calling it, we'll say it's available here, and then we want to print the value of x. So here local variables are only in scope within the function they are defined. This is true for let and var variables. There is a difference between them which I will touch upon here later. The function parameters, they do not use let or var keywords, are also local variables. This might sound a bit vague, but the next code snippet which we will be working on, that will demonstrate what it means. So let's go ahead and call this function. So we'll say test availability and we'll pass a value as argument, and that will be hello. And then we would like to print x here. Is x available? And then we want to print x. Remember that x is a part of this function, so this is its scope is defined between these two curly braces. So if we try to access this outside, it won't be available. Let's go ahead and save this and see this in console. As you can see, the first time when we call test availability, we got it's available here because this is the value which we are passing to the x, and x being available in this console log, it is getting printed correctly. The next time in the console log outside the function, when we are trying to access x, there is no reference. That means the scope of that variable is not outside, and that's why we are getting x is not defined. The statement outside of the function fails because x is a local variable to the function test availability. This is showing that the function parameters are not accessible outside of the function. They are out of scope outside the function and inside scope when they are inside the function. Let's take another look at the function, which we are going to change a bit. Let's use the let keyword, and this time instead of passing it as a variable in the function, we are going to define a y variable, and we'll call it local variable. And now instead of printing x, we'll print y here. And the same drill we are going to do, but this time again we are going to print y, and we'll say it's y available, right? And remember, this time we are using a let keyword to define this variable inside the function, and the scope of this y variable will be between these curly braces. So as long as we save this, we see that inside the function that local variable is available, but outside the function the scope of the local variable is no longer available, and that's why we are getting the reference error. So what happens if I need a value which is inside the function but I want to use that outside the function? Well, we can return the values. The keyword here is values. That means you cannot return the variable itself, but instead a value can be stored in a different variable and then that can be returned. Let's change our test availability again, and this time what we will do is we'll return the y variable as well. And now instead of just calling it, we will be saving that return variable into a variable called z, and here before console logging the y, I want to console log the z as well. So let's save this, and you can see now this local variable value was returned from the function and is now stored in the variable z, and that's why it says it was available inside the function, but because we returned it, it is now available outside the function as well. But since y was defined inside the function and now outside it is being referenced as c, the y is no longer referenced, and that's why we are getting this error. So what happens if we use let instead of var or vice versa? Now the thing is, let is actually not function scope but block scope, and var is a function scope. That means if we define a let keyword inside two curly braces, it won't be accessible outside that, whereas a variable declared with var is available throughout the function. So let's see that in action. Let's create a function which we'll call do something, and inside this we will be checking a value which will be always true, and then we will define a variable x and we'll call it local. Next thing what I want to do is I want to console log the value of x. Now the thing here is that this variable x was defined in the if block, but since variables defined with var keywords are function blocked, that's why it will be available throughout the function. That means between this curly brace to this curly brace, we can access the value of x anywhere irrespective of where it was defined. So let's go ahead and call this function. Save it, and you can see there are no errors and we got local. Now the moment we try to define this with the let keyword, now let is actually block scoped. So this let keyword x will be only available between this if block. So when we try to access that variable which is a block scope, we'll definitely get an error because the scope of this variable is inside these two curly braces and not within the function. So let's save this and see the x is no longer visible to this console log method. Another difference between let and var is that the order of declaration in a script. Let's try to see that in action. Well, what happens if we try to print the x before even declaring it? But let me use the var keyword first and show you. If I save this, you will see that although I was trying to access the x before even it was declared and assigned, JavaScript did not throw any error. It just simply said that the value of x is undefined. What happens if I do same thing with let? With let, JavaScript throws an error saying that you cannot access x before initialization. So this is giving me a reference error that x is not initialized. This is because variables declared with let cannot be accessed before being defined, even within the same block. But the same stuff do not apply for var declaration. Why it doesn't happen with the var is when we use a var variable before the define statement, we simply get undefined. This is due to a phenomenon called hoisting, which means using a var variable before it has been declared results in the variable being undefined rather than giving a reference error. Now let's check about the constant scope. Constants are block scope, just like let. This is why the scope rules here are similar to those for let. For example, instead of defining it with let, let's define it with a const and try to access it before even the declaration of x. You will see now it says cannot access x before initialization. Enough with local variables. Let's talk about global variables. Global variables are variables declared outside a function and not in some other code block. Variables are accessible in the scope, either function or block when they are defined, plus any lower scope. So a variable defined outside of a function is available within the function as well as inside any function or any other code blocks inside that function. It may sound confusing, but it will get clear once we do a simple example. A variable defined at the top level of your program is therefore available everywhere in your program. This concept is called a global variable. Let's see. Let's define a variable called global var, and we'll say it's accessible everywhere. Next thing we will do is we'll console log and saying that it's outside the function. And let's print the globe. Next we'll define a function. We'll call it create new scope, and inside this we'll pass a parameter, and then we'll print console.log, and we'll say accessing global variable inside function, and let's print the global variable. It's done. Let's invoke the function. Or whatever. And again, we will log the global variable saying that still it's available. Let's print it. Let's save this. So as you can see, the global variables are accessible from everywhere because they are not declared in a block. They are always in scope after they have been defined. It doesn't matter where you use them. However, you can hide their accessibility inside a function by specifying a new variable with the same name inside that scope. This can be done for let, var, and const. This is not changing the value of the constant variable. You are creating a new constant variable that is going to override the first one in the inner scope. In the same scope, you cannot specify two let or two const variable with the same name. You can do so for variable starting with var, but you should not do so in order to avoid confusion. Let's create a variable with the same name inside a function. That variable's value will be used whenever you refer to that variable name within the scope of that particular function. Let's again define a variable, and we'll call it global because it's outside. Let's define a simple function. We'll say do something. Inside this, we'll again define x, but this time this x is gonna be local, and we are overriding the x parameter inside this function by creating a new scope. So let's go ahead and console log this x, and this should print local instead of global. So let's invoke our function, and then we'll again console log the x. Now you can see the first time when we invoke the function, it is using the local variable x. But the next time when we are trying to refer to x, this local variable is out of scope, and the only variable which is inside the scope is this global variable, and that's why this got printed on the console. The same is true for using a parameter with the same name as global variable as well. Let's do that. So if we define a global variable here, and instead of defining the x again, I'll say defined for function. Now we'll see that the x which is there inside the function is different than the x we defined outside as global variable. So if I save this one, you can see inside the function parameter x takes the precedence over the global variable which we defined outside. There is a danger on relying on global variable too much. This is something which we'll come across as we start going deep into the programming. We already saw that local variable override the value of global variable. So it is best to work with local variables in function. This way you have more control over what you are working with. This might be a bit confusing for now. It will become more clear when coding in the wild as things gets bigger and more lines and files of codes get involved. There's only one more thing very important which we have to remember before closing this video, is that do not define a variable without using let, const or var keyword. Otherwise that variable automatically becomes a global variable. Let me show you. Let's get rid of this variable, and inside this function I'm just going to define x without any keywords such as let, var or const. Now you will see that when we call do something, the first time it is going to print the value of x, but now since the x defined inside this doesn't have a keyword before it, that means this x becomes a global variable itself. Or let me put something so then it is easier to guess. Inside the function, and we are going to say in this case outside the function. Let's save this and see. Now this value local which we set inside the function is available outside as well. So the thing is, the JavaScript does not see let or var and then it decides this must be a global variable. Even though it gets defined inside the function, the declaration of x within the function gets global scope and can still be accessed outside the function. So if you want to do something with global variable, this is a terrible idea to do it. Whenever you need a global variable, I would suggest you declare it at the top of your file so that it is accessible throughout your JavaScript file. With that, I'm going to stop this video here. If you like the video, hit like and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in the next video.